Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you find yourself in the country or in the world. My name is Jer Swigart, and I'm really excited to have you on this particular live stream. This is going to be an important hour, I think, of our lives spent with one another as we hear from three of the most dynamic women leaders and influencers and organizers in the country. Diverse women whose lives have been deeply shaped by Dr. King's legacy, and who are proactive about pursuing justice and the flourishing of people, regardless of their orientation or faith tradition or skin tone or economic status. And so this is going to be an important time, and it's a time, as all of our webinars are, for us not just to be entertained by eloquence and good thinking, but it's a time to be equipped with tools for us to actually enter into the divides in our country with the hope of restoration. And so I'm excited to have you. As I said, my name is Jer Swigart. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a faith leader. I'm a humanitarian and a peacemaker, an activist, and the co-founding director of the Global Immersion Project. Global Immersion is a peacemaking training organization that's activating the North American church as an instrument of peace. And the work in front of us is really to train Christian faith leaders to move into the divides in our homes, neighborhoods, and country that have been caused by misunderstanding, by conflict, and by war. We want to actively train followers of Jesus to move toward the points of pain in their lives, equipped to heal rather than to win. And so webinars like these are really designed by us to give you access to diverse practitioners and thought leaders who are actively contributing to a just and lasting peace within front and center issues in our world today. And so this is, I think we could all agree that this is an unprecedented moment of American history, even of world history. And this week, it's a unique fusion of Dr. King's birthday and the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 44th president of the United States of America. And so I'm not sure what your experience was like on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but it's a day that for me and my family and for our organization, we really celebrate the legacy of a man whose life and whose words continue to change the world. Dr. King was a pastor who saw religion as a powerful vehicle for social change. He was a prophet who spoke truth to power in ways that exposed our racism and called us to pursue justice. One of my favorite things that he said this: I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyors of violence in the world today, my own government. Dr. King was someone who, with grace, but with boldness, spoke truth to power in ways that changed systems. But he didn't just use words, he used his life. He was a nonviolent practitioner. In 1959, in a radio interview that he gave while he was in India visiting Gandhi, he said, "The choice is nonviolence or non-existence." And then he put his money where his mouth was on that. He was an initiator of the bus boycott in Montgomery, of the economic boycott in Birmingham. He was an initiator of the Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights in the wake of Bloody Sunday. His nonviolent legacy informed Gandhi in India in their pursuit for independence, and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. His dream of a day when humanity would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, is one that has shaped my own life as a faith leader and as an activist and as an everyday peacemaker. And so what a legacy we have to celebrate in a week like this. And then tomorrow is the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 44th president. And I want to be very clear right in the beginning of our call and say that personally, organizationally, and for the purposes of this webinar, this is not an anti-Trump conversation. We are not an anti-Trump organization. We are a pro-human organization. As a peacemaking training organization, we are teaching people and seeking to embody ourselves a pro-human approach to even people that we disagree with. Having said that, I also want to be very clear that we are anti-hate, we're anti-discrimination, we're anti-prejudice, we're anti-injustice. that as an organization and as leaders, we are actively opposed to any system that protects power and violates the vulnerable. And so throughout this political season, it's safe to say that Trump's prejudiced, biased, narrow-minded, and hateful campaign has both exposed and widened the divides in our country. The divides between the rural and urban communities, between the Black and white community, between the citizen and immigrant community. It's widened the divides between the uneducated and the educated, between women and men, between the wealthy and poor, between government and people, between the powerless and the powerful, between Christians and Muslims, between Christians and Christians, between Republicans and Democrats, between Democrats and Democrats, and between Republicans and Republicans. All of these divides have been exposed and widened. And so while there have been advances since King walked the earth, we're yet a divided people. And so on a week that fuses Dr. King's birthday with the inauguration of Donald Trump, we as a people of faith and as local influencers need to learn from King's legacy as he learned from the legacy of Jesus. And instead of merely listening to King's words, we want to understand how his legacy is shaping the influencers and the peacemakers who dwell on the front edges of our national divides. And so that's why we've invited 3 dynamic, diverse women leaders whose lives have been informed by King's legacy and whose leadership impacts thousands. And so over the next hour, we're going to learn of King's impact on their leadership, being that an inauguration kicks off a 100-day period. That's an important period for a presidential administration. We're going to listen in as they share some of their thoughts for their plans of proactive justice, compassion, and restoration in that same time frame. And then we're going to be challenged by them to live, love, and lead like the Jesus that King followed, not as anti or reactive response to anything, but as a proactive outflow of whose we are. And so before I introduce our panelists, I want to give us 4 quick logistical items. Number 1, there's a Q&A feature that's enabled for this particular webinar. And we're always optimistic that we'll get to questions at the end. We're going to do our best to do that. But throughout the course of this webinar, any question that comes to your mind, if you would just throw it into that Q&A chat field, that would be helpful for us as we'll seek to harvest some of those and interact with our panelists on them. So go ahead and do that throughout all of the next hour together. Secondly, we're going to be live tweeting this particular webinar, and we encourage you to do the same. Any kind of thought or idea, or emotion that surprises you, key learning, anything that comes to mind, if you would live tweet that, that'd be great. We're live tweeting. Our handle is @GlobalImmerse, and the hashtag for this particular webinar is MLK Legacy. Hashtag MLK Legacy. So if you just include that in your post, that'd be great. Third, we want to encourage you throughout this webinar to take a screenshot. Use your computer to take a screenshot of a presenter, someone whose thought really inspires you. And then in the aftermath of this webinar, we're going to invite you to post that screenshot with a poignant caption, something that really struck you out of this conversation. Maybe it's something that you intend to do differently. Maybe it's an awareness of how King's legacy has shaped your life. Whatever it is, we'd love for you to take a screenshot and post that caption so that the message of this webinar can spread, and that we can see what the impact of this conversation has been. And if you would tag that with the hashtag MLK Legacy, that'd be helpful. Fourth and lastly, there's a follow-up email that's going to go out a couple days after the conclusion of this webinar that will give you access to the recording of the webinar and any links to any resources that are mentioned here throughout our time together. We want to encourage you to utilize the recording of this webinar as a tool for your leadership team, for within your faith community, within your small group, within your neighborhood community, within your community of friends. Use it as a tool, a viewing tool to share together, to discuss learnings, and then to actually imagine ways that you and your tribe can get proactive in creative love in these moments that cause restoration to spring to life. And so that's a tool that's going to be accessible to you within a couple of days. So without anything else to say, I'm excited to introduce to you the 3 panelists. And so I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right into the conversation. So Rashida, we'd love to start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jer. My name is Rashida Graham Washington. I am the Executive Director for Communities First Association and also the Chief Experience Officer for Live! And Live Cafe. And one of the things that I want to point out about what's so important to this conversation today is that it is my hope and desire that we will serve as at least one model of how to intermingle our distinctives in ways that are enlightening, that really widens the discourse around where we are in our country and in our world in an interfaith kind of way at the table together, and to continue the necessary work of binding the ties between the past and the present of what continues to be a civil rights movement that should be one that we look at certainly nationally, but also globally and across faith. So I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you, Jer. Am I up next? Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be with you, and as I am honored to be with both Alexia and Rashida. My organization is Islamic Networks Group, which is a peacemaking organization that provides education about Islam and Muslims primarily, but we also teach about other religions, as we're also involved in interfaith engagement, which we feel is incredibly important in religious literacy work. We discovered that in order for people to increase their Islamic literacy, that is best done in the context of religious literacy. I think this conversation is incredibly important right now because of the anxiety and the fear that people have about all sorts of things, from fear of Muslims and Islam to fear of Black Lives Matter, not really understanding what's happening there, to fear of the incoming administration. This is a wonderful opportunity to bring people together, and people are coming together as a result of this fear. So there is something positive, coming out of this. So it's a wonderful opportunity, I think, for us to be able to come together, to learn about one another, and to move forward together on common grounds that we discover along the way. So I personally am very, very hopeful. Despite the fear and the anxieties that many people have, I feel very hopeful that this is going to be very good for the country in so many different ways.
So I'm Alexia Salvatierra. It's my turn, right? I'm the last one. I am a professor, affiliate professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. I'm adjunct at a number of other seminaries and universities. I'm also the madrina, the godmother of the Faith-Rooted Organizing Network, and I teach and train around the world, enabling congregations to do justice in a way that is not just faith-based, but also faith-rooted. And in addition, I actually organize. You don't just teach organizing and not organize. So I organize primarily around immigration as an issue and the welcoming of immigrants. And I was one of the co-founders of the New Sanctuary Movement and the Evangelical Immigration Table, and currently run something called the Guardian Angels with unaccompanied migrant children. Rashida and I are also both pastors. So, little thing on the side there. So I think I've been thinking a lot about the spiritual discipline and the spiritual practice of hope. That's really a critical contribution that we make as followers of Jesus at this moment in history to this country. But that hope has to be rooted in lives of effective action. That to me is what stewardship is about effective action. Using all the gifts that we've been given to live into the hope that we've been promised. So I feel like this is going to be a great conversation about what it means to do that at this moment.
Excellent, excellent. So as you can tell, we have a powerhouse dynamic panel here, and so I want to jump right into the conversation around King's legacy. And as you can see, we have three diverse leaders here, and in many ways, the reality of this particular conversation is, in some ways, a touch of the embodiment of a dream that Dr. King had, that there could be a Latina, a Black leader, a Muslim leader, and a white leader as equals and peers having a conversation that is equipping. And so it's it's really cool to be a part of it in this way. And so Maha, let's start with you in terms of legacy. What's been the impact of Dr. King's legacy in your life and leadership?
Sure. Okay. This is a little bit daunting, moving back and forth, but yeah. So I am not really a scholar on Martin Luther King, nor will I pretend to be by quoting him without fully appreciating the man or his mission. I will tell you though that he comes up for me a lot. He's influenced me, and he comes up for me as a Muslim working with other Muslims whose work relates to civil and human rights, who are often activists, do not want to engage with the powers that be, and strongly believe that sitting down with anyone in government, especially with this incoming administration, is akin to sin. I look and I point to Martin Luther King as the way that I choose to engage with government and with the powers that be, which is engagement and face-to-face participation with dignity, with integrity, by teaching and trying to influence change through education and negotiation. So I am for full civic participation, even with this incoming administration. Like you, Jer, I see them as human beings, both Trump and all of his cabinet appointments. I don't assume that they know something that, that I'd like them to know. And I want to be able to engage with them and everyone in government, as I have with the Obama administration and with his predecessors. So I reference Martin Luther King and his successes in that participation, and I will try to and influence my colleagues in the American Muslim community to do the same. Although I fully respect people deciding not to do that.
Excellent, thank you. How about you, Alexia? As you do the work, especially among the migrant community, how has King's legacy informed your life and leadership?
So first of all, I would really need to say that King always reminds me of and points me to a larger legacy, that it's really the legacy of the civil rights movement as a whole. One of my most important mentors in my life has been the Reverend James M. Lawson Jr., who was Dr. King's theologian of nonviolence. He was the chair of the board of CLU when I was executive director. He also trained the students who did the sit-ins at the lunch counters at desegregated Nashville. So I can't think of Dr. King and not think of Dr. Lawson and not think of all the women in the civil rights movement who are often not lifted up in the same way. But it was a whole movement, not just a single individual. But the individual reminds me of the movement and back and forth, because I do think that Dr. King himself is a very important voice in the cloud of witnesses that our Christian faith talks about, the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us and encourages us. And I think that Dr. King is an important voice in that. And when people criticize him for his weaknesses, I always think that his weaknesses are very important, because they remind us that, like the rest of us, he's a sinner and saint at the same time, and that he wasn't a Superman. So he was an ordinary human being doing extraordinary things in the name and spirit of Jesus Christ. That's very important for all of us to remember. I am particularly moved by the way that he trusted that the word would have power not only in Christian circles, but in the whole world. So, when he talked about, I have a dream speech, was actually a sermon connected to Isaiah. And, I have met lots of people who are not Christians or not believers who are like, oh yeah, that stuff King said. It's like, oh yeah, that's in the Bible. So, he knew the power of the word. And I think sometimes when we move into the public arena as people of faith, we leave the power of the word behind, and King never did that. So I think that's an inspiration for me. And then that we can't often change people, but the word can change people, and we need to be good messengers. And then the other piece is there's a particular moment in King's life where he was in deep despair, and he had a very powerful experience in prayer, that he was very frightened. He was in deep despair. His family's lives had been threatened in a very tangible way. And he really experienced the power of the Spirit, and he experienced God speaking to his heart, and he leaned into that and he trusted that. And friends, this is going to be a hard 4 years for many of us, for the migrant community particularly, going to be a hard 4 years if indications are true. And how we're going to lean into the power of the Spirit. And King really did that. Because if we don't, we want to sing. Yeah.
I really love what Alexia just shared about the humanity of Dr. King. And it leads right into the impact of King's legacy on my life and my leadership. I concur with so much of what you've been intentional about pointing out about the movement, that King always wanted to make it clear that it was bigger than just Dr. King, and that there were so many quote unquote hidden figures in that movement that we don't talk about as much. So thank you for naming that, Alexia. Having said that though, what I really love about the life and leadership of Dr. King is the very present evidence of the tension that he carried. I think so many times, as we do when we're talking about history, we romanticize the life of our leaders. And like Alexia talked about, there was a very poignant moment in the life of Dr. King that continues to speak to me, particularly in seasons like this, where you know, his family was in danger and in jeopardy, as many of our families are in these current times and conditions, that he worried and feared for the life of his spouse and his children, as some of us do in this current season. And that King didn't approach God in prayer 100% totally sold out to the hope, Holy Spirit side of himself. Rather, in fact, he leaned into God saying, what is this? That he didn't leave his prophetic voice tucked away in his desk drawer when he went into prayer, but that he really tugged on the Spirit of the Lord to say, what is going on here? I don't understand what is happening here. You have called me to a thing that I do not get and I do not understand. And that to me is very important, because it gives a liberation to leaders, particularly women leaders and leaders of color, who are traditionally marginalized and misunderstood, but also perpetually called upon to be prophetic, to be vulnerable and transparent in saying, I don't always love this thing called call, and I don't always love what I've been called to do. But that he could be like the father of the epileptic boy in the book of Mark, chapter 9, verses 23 through 25, where the epileptic boy is looking to be healed. And the father has the power to call on the Spirit to say, I want healing in this space that is so important to me and my family. But he admits, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. That I believe that when King prayed that prayer, that was the prayer he was really praying to God, that I am hopeful, and that there are days when I'm absolutely also hopeless in what I'm experiencing and what I'm facing. I think King also really understood how critical it was that we lean into our interrelatedness. In fact, he had a quote where he says, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, I'll never be the best me I can be until you are the best you can be. And you will never be the best you can be until I am the best me I can be. And that if we could walk through our lives really believing that our greatness is wrapped up and tied up in one another, I really wonder how that would impact how we connect with one another and our willingness to even get connected and to minimize the gaps that exist between us. And then finally, what really strikes me about the legacy of Dr. King is what Alexia and I, and perhaps Maha as well, neglect to name when we talk about the work we do. And that is the very local, gritty, grassroots, practical, praxis, application component of this work. That when we get so lofty in the work that we do, that we begin to neglect our own rootedness in time, in place, and in relationship, that we are taking the gift of relevance out of the work that is so important to what we do. So that local nature that King had with the cities in which he worked and with the people with whom he worked, I think really speaks to me in times when the work can feel big, when it feels enormous, and when it feels elusive, that I can really literally walk outside my door and connect with a neighbor in a way that's transformational. And that was the kind of work that King was all about. So those are the ways in which his legacy really speaks to me.
Thanks so much. That I want to piggyback on that last comment, Rashida, because I feel like in a world of sound bites, Dr. King has been minimized to the "I have the dream" quote, or injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere quote. And there are words that I think that he's been diminished to, and we lose sight of the fact that he was hyper local, that he rolled up his sleeves as an organizer and as a practitioner, that he walked the streets, that he knocked on doors, that he, I'm even thinking about, what happened in Birmingham leading up to his jailing there. Like for months, he was in conversations with civic leaders, with economic leaders, with faith leaders in that city before they actually showed up with 1,000 friends to say, we're going to actually engage in some creative nonviolence to upset the economic system in this city to draw attention to this. I mean, he was in the trench. And as are the three of you, as are John and I. And so I see his legacy being fleshed out in not only your words but in your lives. And so, Rashida, let's keep you moving, because I think you're hot right now. How do you intend to live, love, and lead in these first 100 days of Trump's presidency? Maybe not as something new, but maybe a renewed zeal, or there's something that you really want to tend to in the next 100 days. What are you thinking about?
So I will tell you that what really resonated with me about President Obama's farewell speech is the statement that he made. He said, if you're tired of arguing with strangers over the internet, start talking to human beings in real life. And this is not a new concept to me at all, but I remember literally jumping up and screaming when he made that comment, because there has just been so much pain brooding on social media. And I think it is a safe place for us to have kick the dog syndrome. And I think in a kind of twisted way, the reason why we do it there is because our humanity won't allow us to be so unloving as to actually kick one another face to face. So what would happen if we actually got together face to face is we would stop kicking the proverbial dog and actually have compassion and a heart for one another to hear things that we're otherwise maybe afraid to tune into. And so what I want to do is to continue to create spaces where we can give ourselves permission to admit that we've been kicking the dog, and to relinquish that part of our lives in a way that frees us up to be together, to not have safe space, but to be in spaces where we are willing to sacrifice being completely safe in order to be transformed and in order to live out lives that are more authentically relational. So we are launching a cafe in Oak Park, February 4th, where people can come together and through facilitated conversations, much like the one we're having right now, we can start to tackle those tensions in ways that are healthy, in ways that exude grace and love. We're also, through Communities First, we have a sojourners cohort where we teach people how to live out asset-based community development, where we stop looking to a theology of scarcity and allowing that to be the model out of which we live. And we shift to a place that says that we actually do live in quite significant abundance. And how do we mobilize the abundance of assets in which we live towards a brighter day for all of us? I will be attending the march in DC. I'm leaving tomorrow to go to the Women's March in DC. And I'll tell you, I am not going there, as Jer mentioned earlier, to be anti-anything. I am going there to be pro-humanity, to be pro-woman and womanist theology, and to practice the gift and the spiritual practice of being fully present with brothers and sisters who just are probably lamenting right now and who are hurting, and to be intentional about just being present without all of the distractions that often come in times like these. And I recently wrote a grant to work with a group of women in a book club in Chicago called Diaspora Hues, Women's Literati and Voice for the Journey, where we will basically read, write, retreat, and repeat through the first 100 days of Trump's inauguration, because there are lots of voices of women of color that are beautiful and are wonderful and are published and do exist. So rather than to focus on what's not here, how do we expose more people to those voices that really are here? And then how do we become empowered by those voices to continue to be a voice in this civil rights and human rights movement? So that's how I'll be spending my first 100 days.
I love it. Let me ask you this. Because so much of your work is focused on asset-based community development, and I think part of your work is helping people understand what are the assets that I bring to the table. And so for those of us who are sitting on this call right now going, I have no idea what my assets are that I would actually be able to put in play. What would you say to us about identifying those?
Well, I would start out by saying that the greatest asset we have are the relationships that we build authentically. And I'm not talking about, I love when Alexia talks about the unnetwork. I'm not talking about the professional ways in which we connect and operate. And those things are fine too. But I'm talking about the ways in which we do life together. The greatest gifts I've received in my life, what I've learned about myself, what I've learned about other people, the resources that I've been able to acquisition towards the ministry and the mission of Communities First Association and Live Exclamation has been almost completely born out of building authentic relationships with people and not seeking out an additional resource, but having the relationship be the thing that I am seeking. And we have lots of ways to help people do that through the kinds of work we do at Communities First and through Live Cafe. But I would call relationships that are non-traditional, relationships that are born with people I might refer to in my life as unusual suspects. Like the fact that Jer and I hang out together might seem weird to someone else. But I have had a lot of depth and wealth born into my life because I was willing to have relationships that crossed what other people might consider to be boundaries. That's the number one asset, and much more will flourish from that place alone.
So good. Give me one more thought. For those of us who look around right now and discover that our friend circle is extremely homogenous, what is the first step that we need to take to begin building those kinds of uncommon friendships?
I would say that in as much as it looks that way, there are probably people within that circle of homogeneity who do have other kinds of relationships. One good way to start is to find those people who look like you, who are in relationships with people who are not like you, and seek engagement that way. The other thing, though, is that I think we have to be careful not to make an idol of safety. Because if we're looking for what is the path of least discomfort to find this relationship, we may never just take the risk of building that relationship. And I think in a world like the one we live in today, where there are so many opportunities to meet up and connect, I'm going to challenge our listeners and encourage them to take the uncomfortable step of going into a place where nobody looks and sounds like you. Don't worry about it and just build a relationship anyway, keeping in mind that people like me, so many people like me, do that every second of every day of their lives. And even that can be an experience that is transformational, as it helps you to better understand what it's like to do that and have to do that perpetually.
Awesome. Thanks, Rashida. Maha, let's go to you. As you're considering these next 100 days personally and as an organizational leader, how do you intend to live, love, and lead in proactive compassion and mercy?
Mm-hmm. So, as you asked the question, I was thinking about the fact that the next 100 days are probably going to be very similar to the last 25 years of a Muslim's life, because we have been in crisis, I think, for that long, at least since I've been fully active in the American Muslim community. I grew up in a very secular household and only come to Islam by having read the Quran for the first time in my life and finding a theology of pluralism that I didn't know existed. had many Jewish friends, had many Catholic friends, and would actually frequent the houses of worship of those organizations, but never really understood Islam, which wasn't difficult because of the way that Islam was portrayed in the media, in American public life. It wasn't something that was very positive. And so I come to Islam by having read the Quran for myself, and finding that Islam is actually quite inclusive. So I enter into the American Muslim community, which was in crisis around the first Persian Gulf War, with the hate crimes and hate incidences that really no one knew anything about because they weren't being recorded at the time, right? It wasn't being recorded until the organization, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and organizations like Muslim Public Affairs Council and others started to do the work. And that's when I think the American public began to take notice of the fact that, that this is happening. Islamophobia has been with us for that many years. But it wasn't until the Center for American Progress that issued a wonderful, which I encourage your listeners to read, at least the executive summary of, called Fear Incorporated, that begins to describe what this Islamophobia is, the fact that it's now become an industry, the fact that there are individuals that are being paid, money is being funneled into these few individuals to produce this vitriol towards Muslims and Islam in the country, that people begin to take notice that Islamophobia is a real thing. Up until that report, up until maybe a couple of years ago, people were still asking whether hate against Muslims in Islam is a real thing, or whether you guys are really making it up or not. Honest to God, it wasn't. People were not aware that this is happening against the American Muslim community. So, I feel like the next 100 days is going to be a reflection of the last 25 years of my life, and the way that we've been responding is exactly through the work that we do, and just sort of piggybacking on what Rashida said about the importance of doing local work. This is the way that my organization is set up. It's very regional, very localized, for the purpose of building real, authentic relationships among people. This is the most important thing that you can do in the work of peacemaking, is to build these authentic relationships. The way we do it with educators, with public institutions like law enforcement agencies, corporations, healthcare facilities, synagogues, churches, Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, and so forth, which is incredibly important, because the more that exists, I think the more that you'll be able to do other kinds of work together, which is what we need to do. And so I think that my organization, all the affiliates around the country, and now we're joined by a network of interfaith organizations across the country that are joining us to do much more of that work. And I personally believe that it does have to be at the local, regional level, where people are holding hands, learning about each other in a very deep way, not in a superficial way. I think that we can all come together on the importance of human rights and civil rights, but I want people to sort of go deeper than that and really understand each other for who they really are, because I think what they'll find is that we have a lot more in common than we have differences, even on religious grounds. The essence of all of the major religions in the world, and let's include humanists in there and secularists, is really the same. And I think that's what we'd like people to learn about. So, I hate to say this, but I think the next 100 days, for Muslims is going to be pretty much a reflection and more of what we've been doing for the last in my activist years in the last 25 years, but doing a lot more of it.
Thanks, Maha. Let me ask you from the perspective of the Muslim community, especially knowing that much of our viewership will be from representing the American Christian community. I've been watching you and friends like Tariq El-Masidi and others from within the Muslim community combat fear in your own community with courageous love. And I wonder if you can, I think that's one part education, and I think that's one part just you all embodying the best expression of your faith. And can you talk a little bit, can you riff a little bit with me on how fear, or on how love trumps fear? How does love break down fear, and how are you doing that within the Muslim community? Because I think we need to learn there's fear driving much of the American Christian community. We need to learn from you guys in that.
Well, I think that being a minority definitely helps us to want to reach out to our neighbors, and to want to reach out to government institutions and the people around us. But for me personally, I can't speak for the entire American Muslim community, but for me, it is a total reflection of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Besides the Quran, the second source of Islamic knowledge is the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, which we know a lot of not only because of the Quran, but because of recordings of the companions about him. He was someone who reached out to people with love and an embrace. He was inclusive of his entire community, not just people that followed him, but people that decided not to follow him, people of other traditions, of Jews and Christians that lived in his community, and always appealing to people to try to understand who he was and what he was preaching. And this is what attracted me so much to this religion. Although I was born into the faith, always identified as being a Muslim, I didn't really embrace and understand the faith until I intentionally became a Muslim after having read the Quran, after having read the Hadith, after having read many other sources, about Islam and Muslims. So, and this is why I started this organization. Really, it's walking in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad in the way that, peace be upon him, in the way that he engaged with his neighbors, with Jews and Christians in particularly that he lived among, and doing it through trying to gain understanding and respect and influence. And so that's why I do the work that I do. And I think that all of the affiliates that work with us, the individuals that are associated with ING in doing this outreach work, it comes from our faith in God, and it comes from the teachings and the practices of our Prophet. It is deeply rooted in that. It is, I don't talk a lot about my work being faith-based, just because we work in the secular community, and we are very respectful of separation of church and state in this country and the law of the land, where we do not preach and proselytize. But I think that we're all moved by what Islam teaches us and how the Prophet lived his life. And despite all of the rejection that that we get, we're not that he also got. We're not trying to sort of convert anyone. But I get some hostility in some of the presentations that I do, and people ask very not difficult questions. We have no problem handling difficult questions. It's the hostility that is sometimes associated with the kinds of questions that we get. I had one person that after I was done giving a presentation, and it was just a beautiful conversation that we were having at a church. And one woman got up and said to the congregation that I'm here to expose you for the fraud that you are. I want everybody to know, how ugly your religion is, and what kind of prophet you follow, and and so forth. So sometimes we deal with that kind of hostility, and we handle it, I think, in the spirit of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which is with love and kindness. doing the best that we can. We're not going to influence everybody, but doing the best that we can.
Thanks, Maha. And can you repeat the name of the article that you referenced earlier, the one about Islamophobia?
Right, Fear Incorporated.
Fear Incorporated, okay.
Fear Incorporated by the Center for American Progress.
Great.
There are other organizations that have also produced reports. I would also recommend the Council on American Islamic Relations. Go to their website, and they also have reports on Islamophobia as well.
Great, and we'll harvest some of that for our viewership. Alexia, let's come to you. How do you live, love, and lead in the next 100 days?
Well, I actually want to start, Jer, for a minute just by piggybacking on some of the conversation about building authentic relationships. And I want to be really honest that building authentic relationships is not easy because of power inequalities. That it's very easy to build relationships that are actually not so authentic, where a lot is kept unsaid, and there's a lot of feelings that are never dealt with. And that I want to say that in my experience, one of the best strategies for building real, just, deep peer relationship is engagement in joint mission as equals. Not, you coming to help us, but us together doing the work. So we got immigrant and non-immigrant churches working together in pastoral visitation for a detention center for children and youth in Fullerton years ago. It was called the Our Children Project. These are all our children. And it was immigrant churches and non-immigrant churches going together. And that built the kind of trust relationship that was very different than sitting across the table and we're all being very nice to each other and we're not talking about some of what we feel or some of what we fear or some of what we've experienced. So I just wanted to say that. But in terms of the next 100 days, we had a gathering at the historic Highlander Center in Tennessee, which was a training center for the civil rights movement, right after the election of a good group from around the country of faith-rooted Christian organizers, mostly Christian organizers. And we really asked ourselves, what is the call at this historic moment? And one of the things that we are very clear about is that a number of the people that we work with that we see as most vulnerable are in danger because of some of what Mr. Trump and his team are talking about doing. Now, many people say, well, don't worry, he's not really going to do any of that. But my grandmother taught me to hope for the best and pray for the best and prepare for the worst. But that's a good way of being wise as serpents and innocent as doves in this world. So we said, how are you going to make sure that people who are vulnerable are protected and defended in this time? So we started something that's being referred to as the Matthew 25 movement. It's a very simple one-line pledge that you can make no matter who you voted for. It says, I promise, I pledge to protect and defend the vulnerable in the name of Jesus. And we want to do two things. One is that we want to build a groundswell that people in Congress that are public decision makers on a federal level can hear that Christians, in spite of the fact that 80% of us voted, 80% of the white evangelical, and about a third of the Hispanic evangelical, voted for Mr. Trump, that doesn't mean that we support all the policies that are going to hurt vulnerable people that he's considering. So we really need to have a very clear, strong national voice, and there will be a website up within the next couple days called Matthew 25 Pledge. But in the meantime, if you're willing to sign the pledge, very simple statement, you could do it at faithrootedorganizing.net. CCDA is also involved. Sojourners is also involved. NALEC, there's a number of organizations. Proctor Conference. So, but what we decided was that there were three groups of people that at this particular moment we think are most vulnerable because of the policies that are being discussed. One of them is immigrants, because our federal immigration system is profoundly broken. Most people know it's ineffective. If you get a step closer, you know it's illogical. You get a step closer than that, you know it's inhumane. But we have fought hard to win a number of regulatory practices which help us to deal with some of the worst of the broken system. And those are probably going to be lost on a federal level very, very quickly, so that people are going to face the full brunt of all of the broken parts of the system, which will break their families and their lives. So immigrants, but also young people of color, particularly African Americans, are also very vulnerable right now, that the Justice Department has really been a national advocate, and that we're not going to have that anymore. In fact, we may have the opposite. And then Muslims, that we're very clear that the proposal to register Muslims is endangering vulnerable people. So the question is, how do we stand for all of those people? And so recognize that some of us are going to be more pulled to stand in one area and some of us in another, even though we're all united in the pledge. So in the immigration area, we're saying we have to do two things. We have to, and I said we had to do two things. And one is this national, and the other one is local, which is talking about local work, is that we need to rebuild these safety nets wherever we can. We need to create safe zones, rebuild local safety nets. And so on the website, there will be toolkits for how to do that. And there are people all over the country rebuilding local safe zones wherever they can. And then, like I said, we have to sign the pledge, and we have to speak on a national level so that we can build this wave. The Witness for Peace, many, many years ago, is credited with stopping the very similar pledge, stopping the invasion of Nicaragua. In fact, Wikipedia credits Jim Wallace and all the other people who started that pledge with doing that. And there was only 80,000 people. So, you know, we think we can get to 1 million if y'all help us, and we think we can really do something in the next 100 days. But we do work locally as well. There are sanctuary coalitions, there are Matthew 25 coalitions around the country that are going to be doing this in different ways.
Excellent. And we'll have all of those links for the Matthew 25 movement and pledge in the follow-up email. Alexia, while you're talking though, why don't you move into the one thing that you would exhort American Christians to tend to in the months to come? And we've heard from all three of you personally and organizationally, and again, knowing that the focus of global immersions work is really the North American church, and there are a lot of Christians in this country right now trying to get their bearings and figure out what's the step that I take right now that moves toward justice, that moves toward restoration. So in addition to obviously signing the pledge, why don't you lead us off with what's the one thing that you would encourage us to tend to?
The day after the election, there was a Facebook conversation between a friend of mine who runs a community development organization in the immigrant community and was talking about the terror of the children in her community, that their parents would be deported, citizen children. And a woman came on the thread and said, how could this election make anybody vulnerable? I don't understand. And all kinds of people jumped all over her. And she came back and she said, look, you can jump on me if you want, but I really don't understand and I really want to. So then there was a very powerful conversation about why are these children crying? You know, and in what way are they more vulnerable right now? And what do we need to do about it as Christians together? And by the end, she said, you know, I voted for Mr. Trump, but I want to work with you to make sure that these children are protected. So if you're in the shoes of that woman where you really don't know, find out. Really take the time and energy to find out, because people are vulnerable and they need you. That's the first thing I would say. But if you are not in the shoes of that woman, if you do know, you know, get your hands dirty. Jump in and be the follower of the incarnate Jesus in actually getting involved in these local coalitions and federal efforts, even though they're not perfect, because really we can, if there's anything we learn from King, it's that we can make more of a difference than we know. But we have to go beyond, as we read in James, we have to go beyond words to deeds. So I would say, don't be afraid of doing something imperfect. Have the conversation with people that don't know, that you know, be bold to do that. And then get involved and be there to protect the most vulnerable.
Excellent. And I'm always stunned by how in our own local context, there is such a wealth of organizations and leaders who are in the fray. And I think sometimes one of the things that really interrupts U.S. American Christian engagement is the grandiosity of like what we think needs to happen versus the simplicity of the step that needs to be taken. And so, you know, to piggyback on Alexia, there are a number of organizations and leaders in your contexts that would encourage you just to get in touch with, do some research and figure out who's doing the work in your own context. Rashida, how about you? What's the one thing that you would exhort American Christians to tend to in the months to come?
I would exhort American Christians to tend to the examination of the ways in which the empire and imperial culture pervades the way that we operate in this country. I would encourage particularly dominant culture American Christians to take that idea of empire, and we've done a lot of study on how the empire has existed in other places, particularly in European countries. And I would love for us to take some time to think about the way that imperial behavior unfolds in our own country and how it produces things like prison industrial systems and mass incarceration, and issues for people who are immigrants, and how imperial ideology affects the lives of women, and how Christian imperialism impedes the health and vitality of people like my new friend Maha and other Muslims in this country. And you know, and I would couple that with that is the examination and research part, which I think in this country and in many denominations we do quite well. After we do that, though, I would let what you learn from that be applied to doing life deeply with people who don't look and sound like you. That if you've been a mover and shaker, maybe you would consider being one who laments and practices spiritual being. And if you've been leaning heavily into lament and spiritual being so as not to have to be a mover and shaker, maybe it's time to consider something different, something more activist related. I think oftentimes whatever we're leaning most deeply into is probably the thing that's creating more safety for us. So I would challenge us to look at what we've created idolatry out of, because all of these things could be good things. But they can also create shadows if we've been living in them too long. And if you've been living in this one thing too long, just being, just lamenting and not doing, or just doing and just helping and really hurting through helping, then maybe it's time to take pause and say, if it is not giving me the depth of relationship, which is what I think God really wants for humanity more than anything, then maybe I need to consider some alternative ways of being a part of the movement. That is my encouragement.
Awesome. And very quickly, if there's one resource that you would recommend to help us get in touch with this concept of empire, what would it be?
Yeah, so selfishly, I would encourage you to take a look at a blog I wrote that is on both my sites, CFA and Live, ! It's called A PhD in Suffering. And essentially what it says is that traditionally in America, we have leaned into the university for all things that we needed to learn. And because the university and the academy was created by people who don't have a lot of practice in suffering, the university and the academy is not going to be able to help us to figure out how to do that well. So unless you build relationships with people who already have PhDs in the process of suffering, the next 4 years is going to be really hard for us. So I would encourage you to look there for some guidance and support.
Great. We'll have that link ready to go for our viewership. And lastly, Maha, and this is really important from a Muslim perspective, how would you exhort American Christians to proceed in the next few months?
So I would exhort American Christians to get to know about Islam and to know Muslims for one main reason. Donald Trump, and I'm not against Donald Trump at all, but his rhetoric, I feel, has really mainstreamed Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. He's called for things like a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we figure out what's going on, as he loves to say. He's called for profiling of Muslims. He's called for creating a database, a registry of Muslims. He's called for monitoring mosques. And so a lot of people feel, a lot of pundits, a lot of experts feel that he's probably going to carry through. He's going to actually do some of these things once he gets into office. His cabinet picks are also of some concern. They have a history of Islamophobia by things that they've said about Islam and Muslims. And so I think it's going to become really, really important for us to stand with most certainly undocumented immigrants who might be targeted, and also American Muslims and Muslims in general. And so if you go to our website, ing.org, one of our staff people just wrote an article, who's a Christian, who wrote an article about how to be an ally to Muslims. It's in our blog. We also have an entire program on how people can be involved in interfaith engagement, which is what I would recommend. If you have concern or you don't know how to begin to sort of engage with Muslims, I would say begin by engaging maybe with the interfaith community in your local area. And I'm pretty sure that Muslims are probably involved now with that community. And if you are courageous and if you have Jer as your friend, I would, or Rashida or any of the people that are on with us, I would contact them and be involved with organizations like that are already doing really great work with the American Muslim community. But I think it's going to become really important, for us to be allies to each other. It's not just Muslims, I think, that are threatened right now. I think it's other people as well. And I think that we are going to be stronger when we stand together.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, the three of you. Thank you for your work and your witness. Thank you for your perspective, your insight, your challenge. Thank you for offering practical insight into steps that we can take here into the future. This has been remarkable, a poignant time, and a needed message for us all right now. To those of you who are listening in, I want to encourage you to think about a couple of things. Number one, what is the one thing that you're going to walk away with? What's the one learning, the one piece of insight, the one thing that challenged you most here in this webinar? And I want to encourage you to post that thought, go live with it, post that thought on Facebook or Instagram with a screenshot. Let that message be told. The message of this webinar needs to move beyond those of us who are listening in. So we want to encourage you to do that. Hashtag that MLK legacy so that we can read in and cheer you on from afar. Secondly, you're going to be receiving this follow-up email with the recording. Again, we want to encourage you to utilize this as a tool. There was gold that was just laid down in front of us. This should be a tool that you can use in your faith communities and small groups to kick open this conversation that actually moves toward the practices that you heard these three women offer us. And so blessings, friends, blessings on you, all of you, as you imagine and then embody creative love that springs restoration to life in your homes, neighborhoods, cities, and country. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. See you then.